Hi guys, it's Mrs. DeLoss. This is actually the same person as Miss Griffin. I just got married this summer. So that's said as DeLoss, Mrs. DeLoss. Anyways, we're going to get started with your first skill we've got in Unit 9. So it's skill 9.1a. And our essential question says, how do we sketch trig functions? How do we sketch trig functions? So today we're sketching, tomorrow or next class we will be graphing, okay? So you probably have never seen a trig function before. It's used with sine, cosine, tangent, but we're going to focus on sine and cosine. And we can measure the angle in two forms, 2 units, degrees or radians. It's just like you can measure the length of, I don't know, your foot in feet or inches, right? So these are just little conversions that you should memorize. Of course, 0 is equivalent to 0. Another big one is 90 is the same as pi. And then 360 is the same as 2 pi. These are your two big ones that you should definitely memorize without question. Now, it's really good to memorize these other two. 90 is the same as pi over 2, and 270 is the same as 3 pi over 2. But the two key ones to memorize are 180 is pi, and 360 is 2 pi, twice of 180. Okay, so we're going to talk about what sine and cosine look like and how we should sketch them using 5 points. So a sine graph always starts on the line. So we're going to give ourselves some key tips here. Sine starts on the line. And what I mean by that is that it starts on this midline here. Starts on the midline. Okay, you can see that in both cases, whether it's a positive sine function or a negative sine function. They both start on the midline. So we start with our first point on the midline, and it also actually ends on the midline. You can see that we're going to graph those in that order, first and then second. After that, the middle is also on the line. So there's 3 points on that midline. A positive sine graph goes upwards first, and then a negative sine graph goes downwards first. And so you'll see that we plot these again in this order, 1, 2, so beginning and then the end. We're going to talk about that over here on the side. So we're going to say always plot 5 points in this order. So first is the beginning, second is the end, third is the middle, fourth and fifth we oddly call the middle of the middles. So again, it goes in this order. We start at the beginning on the line, end on the line, middle on the line. Fourth point is the middle of the middles. So it's like in between your first 2 points, up high for positive sign, down low for negative sign, and then you just connect with a nice, beautiful curve. You're going to do the same thing for negative sign. You start on the line. You end on the line. The middle's on the line. But now we dip down low first because it's negative. It's going to go down into the negatives first. Okay? So sine starts on the line. It's either looking like an S that way or an S this way. You have to know that generic sketch. This is positive sign, negative sign. Now if we move into cosine, we're still going to plot in this same order, but cosine always starts off the line. Starts off the midline. Have our midline right here. You'll notice that on positive cosine, we're starting above the line. On negative cosine, we're starting below the line. And so you'll notice, again, positive starts up high, negative starts down low. And that's for cosine, starting off the midline. But we're still going to plot, again, in the same order. So we start at the beginning, we end, again, up high. So wherever you start and wherever you end, they're in the same spot. So start up high, end up high. And then the middle on a cosine graph is the opposite. So if you started up high and ended up high, then your middle's down low. If you start down low and end down low, your middle's up high. So it's just the opposite. You're thinking about really making like this V shape, but we're just going to connect it curvy. And then your middle of the middles happen to just be on the line. So let me reiterate that one more time. Start up high, end up high, middle down low. On the line for your middle of the middles. And then you connect nice and curvy. That's for positive cosine. For negative cosine, it's the same idea, but we start down low. We start in the negatives. Start down low, end down low. Middle's up high, middle of the middle, on the line. Connect curvy. You want to make sure that you are connecting curvy because if you connect straight, that's an absolute value function, which is very different. Okay, so we don't want to connect straight. Again, your two basic sketches, positive cosine, starts up high, dips down low, comes back up high. Negative cosine starts down low, up high, down low. So what you're seeing here is one full cycle, and we're going to talk about what a cycle means in just a second. Flip it over to the next page. So when we look at these trig equations, you'll notice all these letters, A, B, C, and then you have your trig function, sine, and cosine. A is something called the amplitude. Amplitude is just the height. It's the change from the middle. Actually, I can just show you on this picture that's right here. That would be helpful. From the midline up to the top, or from the midline down to the bottom. Okay, so it's sometimes referred to as the peak from the center of the graph. Okay, amplitude is the height. That's always found in front of the function. A comes first. And notice that this symbol here says absolute value, so it's never negative. Never negative. Now you could have a negative in front of the function, but that doesn't mean that the amplitude is negative, so keep that in mind. The next thing we see is the B, the frequency. When I look down here, frequency says it's the number of cycles it completes in a given interval. So it's the number of cycles in generally 360 or in 2 pi, since those are equivalent to one another. So frequency is the number of cycles. And then the next one that we have is 2 pi over b. So 2 pi over b gives us the period. Period is how long one cycle is. So if I look over here, it says one complete repetition of the pattern is called a cycle. The period of the function is the horizontal length of one cycle. So how long one cycle is. So when we're talking about that, if I get one full sine cycle, the value that's plotted here is called the period. So the period is the length of one cycle. Okay, whereas the frequency would be the number of cycles we have in a given domain or in a given interval in this case. Okay, so period, how long one cycle is. Frequency is how many cycles you have. And then the last piece here is the C value, the shift up or down. So the C value is usually located on the end. It could be rearranged and put to the front, but it's the value that's added or subtracted onto the end of the function, and that shifts it up or down. So you know how we were talking about that midline before, where we have a midline here. This could be set at the x-axis at 0, or we could shift it and say that the midline is going to be here, and then the graph shifts up. Maybe this was a +2 on the end. The maximum and minimum are related to that midline. So the midline is the shift vertically. The maximum and the minimum are the highest and lowest values. Maximum is the highest, minimum is the lowest, of course. And they're found just by adding and subtracting the amplitude from the midline. So I know I just threw a ton of information at you, but we'll come back to this as we get to sketching. You'll see how all these pieces come into play. So the first thing we're going to do is take a look at graphing, or sketching rather, a sine graph. So when I look at this, I notice that it's a positive sine graph because there was no negative in front, and this tells me that it starts on the line. Sine starts on the line, and again, that's the midline. We have to find the midline before we can do anything more in terms of actually sketching, but we can draw a little starter sketch of what a positive sine graph looks like. Whenever you see positive sine, you should have this image in your head, and you should actually just draw a quick little sketch of it, because it's going to be super helpful for you. The next thing we want to do is fill out all these values. The amplitude, remember, is the first value, A. So this is a 2. If it were a negative, I would still only write +2 because the negative would tell me that sine starts by dipping down low. Frequency is supposed to be the number in front of the x value. In this case, it's invisible, so that means it's just a 1. That means there's one cycle completed by the time we are finished with our interval. The next thing I'm asked to do is to find the period. Period, remember, is the length of one cycle. You're going to want to write this out repeatedly until you get used to knowing what the period actually represents. And it says that we're supposed to use degrees. So if you flip back to the previous page, I'm not going to make you flip, but period is written as 2 pi over frequency or 360 over frequency. This one with 360 is in degrees, whereas the other one with the 2 pi is in radians. Remember, it's just like going from inches to feet or feet to inches. They're equivalent to one another, it's just different units. And so with the degrees one, we're going to start with 360 divided by whatever our frequency was, which was 1. So 360 over 1 is obviously just 360. So that's going to set up our actual picture. So we are always going to draw 4 tick marks. No matter what, draw 4 tick marks. On that 4th tick mark, you're going to put your period value. If it's 270, you put 270. If it's 3 pi, you put 3 pi. Whatever your period is, you put it on the 4th tick mark. And then you just cut it in half to find the halfway value. You absolutely have to have the label on your last tick mark. If you can get a label on your second one or even your other 2, that would be okay, but definitely have to label your 4th tick mark to show the length of one cycle, okay? From here, we're going to find the midline. Remember, midline is added or subtracted typically on the end. So midline is at 3. Now you'll notice that we have an x-axis sitting here. This is not going to be our x-axis anymore because I want it to be the midline. I'm going to make my life a little bit easier just by putting the midline right there. Once we find the max and min, we'll draw in the new x-axis after that. So the maximum and minimum are related to the midline and amplitude. So we take the midline and we add the amplitude. We take the midline and we subtract the amplitude. That gives us the highest we can go and the lowest we can go. So midline 3 plus amplitude 2 gives us a maximum of 5. So I'm going to put that tick mark on there. I don't even care if you've counted it out. I don't care where it's placed as long as it's above the 3 because it's higher. 3 minus 2, so amplitude taken away from the midline gives us a minimum of 1, so that goes down below the 3. Now clearly you know in your head that our x-axis would then be somewhere down here. You do have to redraw it and relabel it in order to make sure that you get full credit. So we've got our sketch set up, now we just need to put that cycle on there. We know that our first point is going to be on the line for the midline and the y-axis. That's our first point. Remember, we go beginning and then we go end. Starts on the line, ends on the line. That's point number 2. Middle is also on the line for a sine graph, so that's point number 3. And then because it's positive sign, we already sketched it out, we know that it's going to rise first, that our first middle of the middle, so point number 4, is up high. Our second one is down low. Notice how I've matched it up with where the maximum and minimum are. I wasn't just randomly placing them, I was making sure that they were in line. So now I've got all 5 points. I started at the beginning, the end, the middle, the middle, the middles. And now I just connect, make it nice and curvy. There's your first sketch. Congratulations. We're going to take a look at another example. I know it's a lot to take in, so just keep on trucking. You can do this, absolutely. It's going to take some getting used to. There's a lot to think about, and we know that. So just bear with us and keep following the plan. If you need to go back and rewind, you can absolutely do that. So we've got cosine here, and it's positive because there's no negative in front. Remember that a positive cosine starts off the line. I always jot a ton of notes down to myself because it helps me remember exactly what I want to do, what I'm looking at, what I need to be thinking about in order to make this sketch accurate. So it starts off the line. And when it's positive, it's actually going to start above. So if I think about what a positive cosine starts off the line and starts above, ends above, because wherever you start, you have to end as well to make one full cycle. Middle has to be opposite of that. Middle of the middles then are on the line. Okay? Amplitude is the number in front, so we've got a 3 here. Frequency is the number next to the x, which is 1/2. That means we will have half of a cycle in 360 degrees, or 2 pi if we're talking radians. Period is 2 pi Nope, I'm lying to you. We're using degrees here, friends. You always got to make sure you check that first. So degrees means we're using 360. 360 over frequency, 1/2. Now, if you can't do that in your head, and you tell me that it's 180, I'm going to say, back it up, try again, because this is double division. Double division is happening right here. Divide, divide. Double division really turns into multiplication. If you're not sure that you're going to remember that, use your calculator. 360 divided by 1/2 is the same as 720. So our period ends at 720. This is the length of one cycle, and I'm going to continue writing this out until I get it memorized. Length of one cycle. So I go 1, 2, 3, 4 tick marks, cycle, length on the end. If I can cut it in half easily, I'll label the halfway value. Midline is found at the end by addition or subtraction. So that's a -4 there. So this x-axis can no longer exist as an x-axis because I want to make my life easier and just change it to the midline. We have to draw on the x-axis later, but we'll get there as soon as we know the max and min. So for the max and the min, we're going to start with our midline plus the amplitude and our midline minus the amplitude. So this gives us a -1 for the maximum, so I'm going to label that, and a -7 for the minimum, label that. And then, of course, we have to put the x-axis in there. It would be above here. And now we're ready to go. So remember that we are looking at this type of graph. Positive cosine starts off the line and above it. So start above, that's point number 1. End above, that's point number 2. Now, you don't have to label 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but this is the order in which you should plot them. So we go off the line above, off the line above. The middle has to be down low then. And then middle of the middles are right on the midline. And then when I'm ready to connect, I'm not going to make a V shape. That's not okay. We need to make it curvy. Curve in, curve out. And now you've just properly sketched a cosine curve. We've got 2 more examples together, and then there's 2 more guided practice if you feel like you need it. All right, friends, we're going to get into some radians. It's going to be fun and exciting, and some negatives. Ooh, we're getting fancy. All right, so we've got negative cosine. So this tells me it starts off the line because it's cosine. Starts off the midline. And it must start below the midline because it's negative. So I'm going to make my little sketch. Starts off the line, ends off the line, curve up, curve down. Okay? If you want to, you can put your 5 key points on there. That helps you make your sketch in the end. So amplitude, some of you might automatically want to say -6, but remember, it's just the number in front, not the negative. The negative tells us that it starts below. Frequency is the number next to the x, so that's a 3. Period in radians is 2 pi over the other guy, so 2 pi over 3 in this case. And remember, that means the length of one cycle. So here we go, 4 tick marks, 1, 2, 3, 4. Length of one cycle, 2 pi over 3. Can we cut that in half? What's half of 2 pi over 3? Well, you got to start with 1 pi over 3 before you can get to 2 pi over 3. And again, if you struggle to come up with this value, it's okay. You don't have to have it, but you absolutely have to have the 1 on the end. Okay? Let's see. We need our midline. Midline is usually added or subtracted on the end. If it's not on the end, check in the front. If it's not at the front, that means it's +0. So our midline is actually at 0, which means the x-axis can stay, because 0 is the x-axis. Y equals 0 is the x-axis. All right, maximum. So this would be 0 plus 6, 0 minus 6. Remember, it's these two added together and then amplitude subtracted from midline. So +6, -6. It's actually easiest if there is a midline of 0, because then you don't have to move the x-axis, and then it's just plus and minus whatever your amplitude is for your max and min. Okay, I think we're ready to go. Our first point starts down below. Our end point finishes down below. The middle has to be opposite. And again, I'm referring back to this sketch that I've already made out. Makes our lives so much easier. So we start at the beginning, the end, the middle, middle of the middles. And connect curvy. I know that you're seeing that V shape. but connect curvy, that way you can get full credit, because otherwise you've made an absolute value graph. All right, last one together, friends. Here we go. We see a negative and we see a sign. So again, sign starts on the line, starts on the midline. And if it's negative, it's going to dip low first, or dip down, however you want to say it. So quick starter sketch starts on the line, dips down, up, back to the line. And again, if you want to put your 5 points, your 5 critical points, that could very much help you when you're making your actual sketch. Amplitude is the number in front. So here we've got a positive 1/2 that gets written down, not the negative. Negative told us to dip down. The frequency is the number next to x. That's 6. Period in radians, so 2 pi over frequency. 2 pi over the other guy is what Mr. Rogers likes to say. So 2 pi over 6. Okay, if you want to reduce it, you can, but sometimes it's easier to leave it that way. That way when you're coming up with your halfway value, your halfway number, it's easy to cut in half. Right, so 2 pi over 6 cut in half becomes 1 pi over 6. If you did reduce this would just be 1 pi over 3, and still a halfway value there of 1 pi over 6. It's just a little harder to think about cutting 1 pi over 3 in half. Okay, here we go. Midline is the number on the end, -2. So I can't have this here because that would be a 0. -2 is going to go here. Maximum is taking these two and combining them. So -2 plus 1/2. I'm going to change that to a 0.5, right? That's the same. 1/2 is the same as 0.5. And -2 minus 0.5. So we've got a -1.5 and a -2.5. Now some of you might be like, oh, I can only go up a half. I'm going to put it right here. No way. You're going to put it where you normally would put it. -1.5, -2.5. Okay, and then my x-axis would go in somewhere up here, above that negative. And I'm looking back at my original tiny sketch. Negative sign starts on the line, ends on the line, middle is on the line. Think about where your first middle of the middle needs to go. Is it positive or negative? It's negative sign, so we need to dip down first and then jump up. And voila. And again, I just want to point out that I have kept these in line, right? So if you need to draw these dotted lines for yourself in order to make sure that you line them up appropriately, then please do, by all means. So what you'll notice with this last page is that it's extra guided practice. So I'm going to go through it as if it's notes. If you need it, stay. If you don't, try them on your own. Or start writing your summary, okay? So I'm looking at this one, example number 8, and what we've got going on here, I'm not sure why it's example 8, it should probably be 7 and 8, is 3 sine 4x, sketch 1 complete cycle using degrees. All right, so we're going back to degrees, getting away from radians for a minute. We see that it's a positive sign, so positive sign starts on the line. So if I make my little positive sign sketch, I know that it starts on the line, jumps up, dips down, comes back to the line. 5 critical points, beginning, end, middle, middle of the middles. Okay? Amplitude is the number in front. That's a 3. Frequency is the number in front of the x value. That's a 4. Degrees tells me to use 360 over frequency. So 360 over 4 in this case gives me 90. That's where my 1 cycle ends. Length of 1 cycle. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 cycle ends at 90. Half of that is 45. Again, you have to have this value. If you have the halfway value, that's great. But if you get it wrong, you lose points. Okay. Midline is non-existent, so that's a 0. That works well with an x-axis, so you don't have to move it. And then maximum and minimum are very easy now. So we have 0 plus the amplitude, 0 minus the amplitude, so that gives us positive 3 and negative 3. Positive 3, negative 3. And now we're ready to sketch based off of that positive sine graph that we drew off to the side. Start on the midline, end on the midline, middle on the midline. Positive sine jumps up first, dips down low. Connect, nice and curvy, and you got yourself one full cycle. Remember, one cycle has a length of 90. Last one together, and then you'll get some practice on your own in the actual practice packet. All right, so I see that it's a negative cosine, so jot a note to yourself right now. Think about, where does cosine start, on the line or off the line? You should be thinking starts off line. And because it's negative, it's going to start below the line. So if I make a quick little sketch, starts below the line, ends below the line, middle's got to be opposite, and then we make it curvy. So we've got our 5 critical points, beginning, end, middle, middle of the middles. All right, amplitude, number in front. Do not drag the negative with it. The negative told us to start down low. That's all it's telling us. It's not a negative amplitude, because otherwise your max and min are going to be mixed up. Frequency is the number in front of x. There's an invisible 1 there. If it doesn't exist, it's a 1. Unlike midline, if it doesn't exist, that's a 0. Period using radians. So 2 pi over the other guy being your frequency, which is 1. So this is just 2 pi. Remember, this is the length of one cycle. Write it until you've got it memorized. And even when you have it memorized, write it again. So 4 tick marks, 2 pi is your end point. Half of that, half of 2, is 1 pi. From here, we've got our midline. Midline is, nothing here, so that's a plus 0. 0, again, works very well with an x-axis. If this was not a 0, we'd have to cross it off. We'd have to move it elsewhere. Maximum would be midline plus amplitude. Minimum, midline minus amplitude. So I just pulled those 2 numbers from over here. 5, negative 5. Tick marks, 5, negative 5. And now I come back to my original little sketch of negative cosine. Start at the beginning, down low. The end finishes where you start, so down low again. The middle here has to jump up high because it's got to be the opposite for cosine. And then we are on the line, on the line. So remember the order for plotting: 1 at the beginning, at the end, middle, middle of the middles. All right, and then nice and curvy. Woo! You survived, friends. You did it. So you're going to take some time. Jot down things that you noticed or that you know you have to remember. Maybe a positive sine graph, a negative sine graph, positive cosine, negative cosine. Maybe you also want to talk about what frequency is and what period is. How do you find the mid from an equation? Where do you get the max and min from? What the heck is an amplitude? Right, so talk about these things. Talk about what 2 pi is equivalent to in degrees, or what 1 pi is equivalent to in degrees. There's lots of things that you just learned that you can talk about in your summary right now.